Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming to this is the final episode, the final talk in this season's Interchange. We're going to keep on going and start again in September, but I'm really excited to end off 12 weeks of talks that some of you may not know are focusing on the intersection of artists working at the intersection of physical and virtual spaces. We've had artists that work across physical and virtual mediums, and we've also had people that are working primarily in virtual reality. And I think that it really makes sense in a way to end off the season looking at Michael DeLucia's work. I feel that well, his work has personally been hugely inspirational for me, but his work has this sort of intimate kind of collision in a way of virtual media, virtual systems with very physical media, oftentimes in a truly kind of rugged way where there are virtually modeled 3D modeled forms that are physically driven and carved into material that is not, that has very much its own organic character to it. So I think that if anything could kind of signify what we're talking about in this series, I think it's that. So please give a welcome to Michael DeLucia.
Thanks, guys. It's good to see everyone. Thanks, Alex. That was a great intro. And thanks to everyone at Brooklyn Research for inviting me. This lecture series has been really great, and I'm really excited to be included. Sorry, I just gotta switch modes here. So I want to talk a little about the aesthetic experience of workspace. It's something that I think has like a cyclical influence over the work that is generated in a space, and with the types of media we're using these days, that kind of folds back into what you can make, and then how you just design your space around that, and how that becomes generative. So I'm including a few images of some studios that helped me form my sort of early idea of what a sculpture practice would be. This is Konstantin Brancusi in his studio. I saw a really great exhibition at one point in Venice at the where was that? It was at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. And it was an exhibition of images that he had taken of his work in his studio. And they were really specific and interesting. And it really changed my perception of his work. It sort of changed completely how I understood it. Just gonna go back to this one slide. I was initially really attracted to the mystique about his studio practice, and I think that comes from some sense of order amidst a chaotic environment. The objects in that space are all so similar. You can't tell the boundaries between the work and the tools and the architecture and the raw materials are all very blurry. It's all kind of, is this finished? Is this a sculpture? It kind of creates this believability, where you're in an environment where you're the abstraction, you're the foreign entity in that space. You can see Another thing that occurred to me is from seeing his studio is you can see these forms repeated. They transcend material and scale, and it gave me the idea that his subject wasn't necessarily, or the artwork wasn't necessarily tied to physical material, but more it's kind of a theoretical idea of something, and the work itself is like a collective experience of all these different iterations, manifestations, and contexts. These are a couple really nice images that support that idea. He was obviously very specific in what he was looking at. These two objects are in a really temporal lighting condition, and they just seem very heightened and particular in that situation. So there's a reconstruction of his studio in Paris at the center, at the Pompidou Center, and they have a room full of his tools, which was really also kind of an epiphany to me. Like, you could see how the tools that were used to make these objects informed their, how he arrived at those forms. Like the bird in space, kind of was borrowed from the horn of his anvil, and the saw blades probably. Sorry, I gotta get back here. The saw blades showed up in this depiction of a rooster. And this, I think, is actually, I think that's actually a tool. I think it's a screw for like a mill or something. I don't think that's actually a sculpture. That was inspiration to him, so. And then there's Mondrian. Again, there's this environment in which he lived, I believe. And you really can't discern his work, his paintings, from the architecture and the utilitarian objects inside. Like that stovepipe is kind of one and the same as the black lines that are in his paintings. And I think working this way influenced probably his lifestyle choices, like the type of objects he wanted to interact with. That chair, I think, is a really good example. It's like a lattice, of structural lines that, double as a seat. And here's just another recreation, but it's good to see it in color, I think. Another really influential experience I had in an artist studio. I worked for Jeff Koons for a couple, not even a year actually, but between undergrad and grad school, I worked for Jeff Koons, and I was pretty young and impressionable. I think I'm in the back there somewhere, right there. Anyway, it was like really inspiring to work in this space where all this crazy stuff was going on, and there were great people, a lot of them, and it really expanded my notion of what the function of a studio is. Jeff wasn't really involved in the fabrication of his work, which put him in a interesting position to really be objective and to kind of understand. I think he was creating an experience for himself to walk through and experience his work. And he didn't work on it himself, but he really valued the idea of labor as a kind of investment in the value of the work. And so, economy of means didn't exist in that studio. It was really like the more energy that went into something, the more powerful a piece of artwork it would be, as far as he was concerned. And so he would often invite a lot of people to come through, collectors, friends, celebrities. And, you know, because he wasn't like involved day to day, I think he could really be sensitive to what the enhanced value of having that experience was. And so he was really specific about a lot of the things, like aesthetically, that define that space, like this scaffolding. I'm sure it would have been better to have, you know, some kind of prefabricated scaffolding, but it looks like, you know, something that's built with somebody's hands, and that, you know, you feel that when you come into a space like that in front of the work, and you see the work that's sort of half done, and you understand like all this energy and labor that goes into it. And yeah, he had an understanding that their appreciation was heightened through this experience, and I think that's because he had the same experience in his studio, which I kind of envied. Excuse me. So here's a few shots that I dug up of old studios that I've had since being out of school. This was the second studio I had. It was excuse me. It was taller than it was wide, so I had to build this like makeshift dumbwaiter for lifting stuff up to that loft to get it out of my floor space, which was limited. So, and it wasn't really like a workspace. It was the vestibule to this loft apartment where all these subletters would sit or would live. So they had to like trudge through all my stuff. The door was over here, and that's where their apartment was, behind that plastic curtain. So it all worked out really well somehow. They were like interested and curious what I was doing in there, and it didn't bother me, so that was great. But I had to move on. Here's a little shot of it cleaned up for a studio visit. I think I hoisted everything up to where I'm standing with the camera. Then after that, I moved into a really much larger space which was super cheap because it was in a very poorly maintained building, and it had tons of problems, but it was really nice to be able to spread out after that. And so, yeah, I mean, I dealt with rats and leaks and break-ins, and it was kind of crazy in itself, but that was another like really great experience of a studio. Yeah, I could never do stuff on large scale. I mean, I'm not sure if these were strong works, but it was really important to be able to work that way, at least briefly. And that did sort of lead to some more important stuff that I developed while I was there, which I would never even have been able to think of without the space. So that was unique in New York City, I think. This is a shot of, I think, taken on the day I moved out of that space. This is my new space, and the goal is, you know, I want to be comfortable in my environment and have, you know, total freedom, basically, to. I want to feel unobstructed and able to pursue any experimental notions. I mean, it's, you know, that's a lofty goal, but yeah, you know, that's the idea. So this is just a little tour of my studio. It's got skylights, which is cool. I've never had natural light before this one. This was the reason I had to move out of that other space, because I worked up to the point where I could get my own CNC machine, which is a really critical part of my process at this point, and that required a different kind of space. So we'll talk more about how I use that in a little bit. And this is that same room that you saw in the beginning, but cleaned up for a presentation. I built myself a little room so I could test out this idea of like projecting some of my models onto that surface with the router. And so if the studio is kind of the front end of my process, the back end would be 3D modeling software, which is really where at least half of the creative energy goes, or happens. I had the term virtual in quotes because I always felt like that's a kind of limited notion. Like what it means is it's almost real, but I prefer to think of it as, you know, as somebody who's really fluent with the software. You know, that space behind the screen feels real to me when I'm using it. You know, I'm like totally. Alex Benenson, who's a friend of mine, pointed out that it's kind of an out-of-body experience that you have. Like when you're playing a video game and you're just, you know, all of your cognitive energy and focus is sucked up by that activity. You forget, you know, you're distracted from the fact that you have a body and you're completely in that space, and it's, you experience it in real time, you interact with it, you make changes there, and as you acquire the skills to manipulate it, you know, gain the ability to navigate effortlessly. Just like when you're learning to, you know, when you're born and you learn to walk and stuff. I kind of think it's like, you know, the space inside of a fishbowl. You don't go in there, but you can see in it, and it's a little distorted, but you believe in it, and you understand that space, and there's no question about, you know, you don't have to second guess yourself. You know, it's like it's real as far as you're concerned when you're manipulating those files. This is just some toolpaths on some joinery that I designed for a sculpture to hold something together. I tend to take these shots, I think similar to like the way Brancusi would shoot his stuff in his studio in a less formal way. I'm just like literally taking an iPhone photo of my screen, but like there's moments where you step back and you're like, geez, this is pretty weird. I should remember this, you know, and that sort of feeds back into decisions I make down the road or not, you know, I don't know. It's just cool. I have a collection of these. One thought that arises kind of frequently is like there's some kind of driving force behind software development that seems to want to make the user interface assimilate the real world. You know, like there's analog tools like in Photoshop, you've got a pencil and a paintbrush and a spray can, stuff like that. When those are really just different definitions for line quality, and it's got very little to do with actual like a paintbrush or you know, it's not graphite. You know, they're just sort of making the interface, or my hunch is that they're making the learning curve as tolerable as possible until you can discover the extended capability that these tools offer. And just sometimes interfaces can be frustrating because they tend to want to conceal all of the system, but I really prefer these moments where the simulation breaks down and you sort of see behind the curtain. You can see the system. The UI becomes transparent. You can see the system. In order to manipulate 3D models, the form and its attributes, or the object's attributes, really have to be separated into different data sets and organized in layers or channels. And so, you know, things like form, color, texture, reflectivity, you know, attributes like this get split apart and then recompiled, which is fine. But I think again, to just try and simulate the real world. I sort of see that as besides the point a little bit. I think it's much more interesting, again, when those things break down, and you could sort of call this a like glitch, but I don't know if it technically is one, because there's no problem here. It's just like the file is defined in such a way that it's not working out for your graphics card, so it's like there's no problem with the object, it's just not compiled correctly. So you start to get sensitive to like an alternate set of physics that governs that space. There's no gravity, but people talk about big files as being heavy. That's like an analogy between data and matter. It's like if there's so much data, the computer has to process it more and it lags, and you're like physically almost like pushing your mouse, like clicking really fast to like make it as if that's going to help, but it's really like there is a kind of analog physics system going on there, and it has more to do with, it's like your processor is the body that you have to manipulate these objects in that space. So it's kind of a surrogate for you. Another huge advantage is it's very cheap. It's super fast. You can really iterate. You can simulate ideas. You can try many outcomes. You don't have to invest any energy into moving materials or purchasing materials. It's just, you can kind of develop really rapidly in that sense. This like rainbow action that's going on there, by the way, is that's an interference pattern that comes from, it's between the pixel grid of the screen that I'm shooting and the shape of the lens and the pixel grid of the receptor, or the pixel grid of the screen that it's displaying, actually. But I think it's interesting how there's like phenomena that manifest when you filter these virtual objects back through reality and then back into their, into that digital space. I don't know, that's just kind of an interesting kind of a tell, like another moment where the system's kind of revealing something. It's these are just a couple of views of a wireframe object that I thought was nice. These are toolpaths of a piece that I made. The yellow line would be the path that the cutting tool of the CNC router will follow. And sometimes that in itself is kind of like, that's like a visual experience right there that I think in a way rivals the piece that it eventually became. So the aesthetic of this workspace is really striking, and there's a lot of surprises that happen along the way, and you can't. It's hard to understand what their value is. Like this is a moment where I just needed to check the direction of a very complicated set of lines, and all these arrows come on, and it just is this noisy chaos that suddenly, manifested, and there's no way to capture that. It's just kind of a fleeting moment that happens. The best thing I can do is just take a snapshot of it. But these things really filter back into how I think about, they really give me ideas for the next work to come. oh, and they really filter back into, that sum total experience of what the artwork is, like the physical manifestation with the file that you were working on. It all kind of like adds up to this thing that's not just specifically the physical object in the end. And I really, working with digital media really emphasizes that. That's becoming a really important way of thinking about the work that I want to make. So then, the problem becomes like, how do you translate this to someone who's not in front of your screen while you're defining it? And you can describe it, you can show them, but like the making of it is really like, you have to be kind of capable in that space in order to fully understand like, how it moves, how it scales, like how it came about, so that is basically the principal challenge behind my project. Yeah, and the thing about digital files is they don't exist, but the evidence is so convincing that we believe in them, like they do exist, we just have to acknowledge them, that's all. So I'll show you a couple comparisons between the files that were used to create some artwork and talk about a little bit about how they relate. So the one on the left is a screenshot of the file that was used to create this, and the blue lines are the tool paths that were used to cut this piece. And I'm sorry I don't have a close-up. I'm realizing the resolution's not going to be tight enough for you to see. But this is actually like a height field that was engraved. So it was a 3D model of a tire that was compressed into the thickness of the Formica fake stone veneer that was on top of, that was laminated to the plywood substrate. And so it was about an 1/8 inch thick, and I cut that in relief, and it kind of exposes this image of that object, like an impression. And I'll go back to this for a second, because this turned out to be a hoax, but it was a really convincing, something about it inspires the imagination and the need to believe in something that's, hyper real. I guess it's just so unexpected, and so what does it do? It's this strange shape that comes surprisingly. It's massive, and it's hard to explain. So your mind goes wild and jumps to the conclusion it wants to, really, which is that aliens exist, obviously. And I just like the idea that like a simple mark can suggest the existence of this unimaginable form. And every viewer is going to have a different image in their mind of what that thing looks like, and I think that's a really powerful suggestion as well. So I'm thinking of that sort of situation here, where I'd like to make this impression of this file that doesn't exist or does in kind of this non-material way, and that sort of triggers your belief system. And so, what made that impression? And I also recognize that people don't understand what CNC technology is or what 3D modeling is, and so that kind of, there's a mystique there that kind of plays into how people experience this work, and I think that's a really good thing, actually. Here's an object that on the left that happened by accident, and it was, just sort of thought, how would I make this? And so I had already sort of developed techniques with milling wood so that it would have these patterns on them, which come from different milling operations, which are just ways of approaching a surface with a milling machine. And they create these interference patterns, and that sort of was an analog for what was going on here, giving that thing its surface. Forgot to show you guys some models. I'm just going to jump out of this presentation so I can present these for a second. Ooh, there we go. So I just wanted to show you kind of what some of these experiments that I've done, you know, what it's like to move around that space and experience these weird things. And they're all sort of designed to interact with the display adapter in weird ways or to challenge it. But for whatever reason, this one's like a super light one, even though it's like really, really dense. It runs really well. A lot of them don't. But you know, you get through that, like this feel that you get from rotating it, it gives you a sense that it's made out of something very light. And that's an experience that's hard to translate. This one is a stock model, which I also have a collection of. I like these ones that kind of have an extra sensitivity or just are really economical or just strange for some reason. Anyway, I collect these models from websites that people trade props that they don't want to spend time on for like the background of film scenes or video games and stuff. And so there's like, you know, a sea of weird objects out there. Yeah, that's a really nice one. And I think you'll see these kind of echoed in some of the work I'll show you afterwards. Change the lighting on this a little bit. Sorry, the resolution's a little low, so it looks pretty dark, but until you zoom in. But this is probably my favorite one, I think. They like invert. They don't seem like a volume. You know, they seem spatial, or I don't know. They create like a third illusionistic space. Here's the last one. This is one I've used a lot. This is bananas. Whoa. All right, I'm gonna get so there you have, like, you know, I'm trying to make an analog to that weird purple thing that came first, and you know, yeah, you just come across them. You develop like a sensitivity for what's going on in that workspace, and you start to notice it when you go into a dollar store or a hardware store or grocery stores, whatever, you know, like wherever you are, like you see stuff that reflects the new sensibilities that you've gained doing this kind of experimentation. That on the left is made of styrofoam. That was created by slicing very thin slices almost all the way through that pentagonal solid block of styrofoam. And so it just sort of slumped over on the left, which is not, I mean, this one obviously doesn't have that gesture, but the reality layer, there's extra physics going on here that I think was a nice development from that. And this is the styrofoam version of that one that I showed you earlier, which I said was my favorite. It was that's like a version of it that just has different lighting scheme going on. But that's a still of that same file that I just showed you. And I'll segue into showing you a bunch of work starting with some drawings. But if you guys have any questions at any point, feel free to just jump in. Mm-hmm. That was cut with a wire cutter too, like really long triangles back and forth, and then I rotated it and did that again. So you end up with these like really skinny pyramids, some of which aren't, it's not, a lot of them broke, it's very, very fragile. So you just get this kind of like half organic thing, or this like transition from geometry to like non-geometry. So the drawings are kind of the easiest way to output some of these things. I have a plotter, and you just press plot, and it will trace the wireframe of any object. And so that one on the right is somehow derived of that red cube point cloud object that I showed you a little bit ago. And I resorted to like minimalist geometry basically as a default, just to try things. If I wanted to try a new pen or graphite, I might just start simple to keep the variables minimal. Occasionally this thing happens, which I really enjoy. When I wake up, I don't recognize what I'm looking at. Like if you don't move your head right away, does this happen to any of you guys? You just open your eyes, but you don't move your head, and like you're seeing something like a tissue box or something. You can't understand it. It looks amazing. And then you finally get up and you have this epiphany. It's like, oh yeah, obviously. It's kind of a letdown, but also kind of a relief. That you still understand your world. Anyway, I get kind of like focused on certain objects in my environment and that state of flux that they can be in at some point when you're confused, when your own visual system doesn't work for you. There's other situations that can induce that too, but so these are kind of studies of things that I just kind of get focused on in my own environment. This is another fish tank, one of those hexagonal ones, half full of water with gravel on the bottom. And these are kind of just those default tests that I'll do. This again on the right is one of those it's derived from that same file that I showed you, the red one. So the first way the first way I realized that I could sort of get these abstractions out into physical world is by making analogies with things that I would see. So this, I don't have the file anymore, but this is based on a file that just sort of had a plane that interrupted some straight lines, and they became disorganized on the other side of that line. And I sort of saw it as a drawing of like what happens to water when it, or sorry, what happens to light when it goes through water or glass or some other kind of transparent medium, or maybe something that's like not, that's something that's translucent rather than transparent. And so, again, yeah, I'd be like sort of sensitive to these gestures that I've been working with, and you know, you see a broom in the store, and you're like, ah, I should just glue those together. There we go. There's a lot of construction going on in New York City, so when I'm not staring at a screen, I'm staring at a chain link fence or something. So I started to realize that the screen is kind of this weird physical barrier. You know, I can't enter this space. I can see through it. You know, it's transparent. It's also like a rectilinear grid. And so I started to enjoy that analogy. You know, it's like kind of frustrating that I can't actually get in there physically, but and there are these spaces that are behind chain link fence that, you know, one side is nice and the other's not, and so that's kind of an interesting analogy that came from that. And so I started interacting with that type of plane. You know, thinking of the experience of learning that system, you know, it's frustrating and restricting, and so yeah, I think these mops were really like surrogates for people in a system, like kind of societal gesture. This type of thing is just really an exercise in kind of killing the notion that an object has like a definite surface. You know, like the reality between me and that thing is kind of kind of fuzzy. This is a little bit of a wild card. Remember that dumbwaiter I told you about? I had to buy all this extra yellow rope because it like came in 100 feet or something. So I had that lying around, and I was like, what am I going to do with that? So that, yeah, anyway, this was like a gesture that I had made, the roses with the hoses. And that part was sort of, that was similar to a file I had made, and then that just solved this solution that involved gravity in the real space. Again, a bunch of mops that were sort of surrogate people, shoved, you know, dipped in plaster, concrete, and shoved into the corner. Here, there are some things you can do in that system that you can't really do physically. One of them is like you can mirror an object like super easily, and so I was kind of obsessed with that notion for a little bit. And so again, there's like a plane where something's shifting on one side. You know, it's kind of like you're on one side of the screen, your object's on the other side. There's like a different kind of reality on either side of these planes. And on the right, it's a graphite drawing of a fire hydrant that was one of those stock models, and beneath it is a really, really low res, low poly version of that same model. I just dialed it down, and it kind of got disrupted and started to break apart. And that idea came from seeing a garbage can in a puddle of water, and it was kind of windy, so the reflection disrupted the the image of that garbage can. But anyway, that sort of related back to the like lo-fi quality of economical modeling. This piece was, so I bought this broken washing machine on Craigslist, and it was in perfect condition except it didn't work. I made a model of it by hand, like in the classical tradition, and then I like beat the hell out of that washing machine. And again, it's just kind of like the idea of copying something destroys it in a way, or like through copying something you realize how it's impossible to perfectly reproduce anything. So this is just a straight up mirror piece. Couple other weirdos. What was that? These were these were strange. I mean, again, I was just like I was digging deep for ways to assimilate these gestures that I had made, that I knew that if I actually like kind of made the model as it was on the screen, it would lose so much, you know. So I'm trying to look for things, materials that we understand and have different relationships, and recontextualize them in this like gestured way that would just be uncanny, I guess. Yeah, I found a lot of playful ways to like mimic things that I was doing on the screen. And then I discovered, discovered CNC techniques, which is, CNC stands for computer numerical control, which is really just like a robot cutting machine that will reduce material to the surface of your 3D model, and it can happen at different scales, and it can cut lots of different materials. It's not really restrictive. So these were kind of a much more straightforward export of the model, but I was really interested in styrofoam because it was so bright when it was fresh. It was like luminous, you know, like these things looked like the way the display drew them on the screen. You know, they were almost whiter than white. And also I liked it as a kind of surrogate marble material that related back to like classical sculpture. But they're super fragile. Those are dollar store static dusters on the top there. I think that was supposed to be earlier. Things are a little out of order. That's just an action shot from the milling process of that one on the right there, this guy. Sorry, that was not supposed to be there either. This was a show I did in Paris. So that styrofoam project sort of came to an end because it was just a really expensive process for me, and it was hard to keep doing that. So that's when I sort of pared it down to 3-axis milling and things that I could do with a low profile. Which was, you know, sometimes a constraint is the best thing for generating new ideas. You know, those limitations can I don't know, something about constraints that can really cause you to like work harder to think of something. And so all of these were made out of basically sheet materials put together in pretty rudimentary ways with drywall screws and, you know, like a lumber frame inside of the sculptures. And this show, all these forms are based on the form of a projected image. So if you imagine like the shape of the projection coming out of the projector up there, it would be a pyramid where the point is the light source and the base rectangle face would be the, you know, where it hits the screen, where it's where that beam is interrupted by a plane. So all of these are kind of manifestations of that. Yeah, I was always also interested in how that shape is like it's used in a lot of spiritual functions, like a projection from the heavens or something. It's interesting to think like what the content would be, like some YouTube video or something. This one on the left is like a spotlight in a corner. The one on the right, a movie screen. So these all have like basically some relationship to a light source and a receiving plane. These would be the light sources themselves. As a way of dealing with the like intensity of those light sources, if you take a photo of something, there's a limited spectrum that can be reproduced, and so like if it's too hot, it blows out. So that's what I was doing. I was using the thickness of the plywood as the value envelope that I could describe, and so I'd intentionally let it blow out. I'd let it go to zero, and just like the material would break down at the hot spots. This one was actually describing like a glint or a sparkle on some kind of reflective object. I like how far the actual like manifestation of it comes from the impetus in some cases. It's a really aggressive process, and I think, we all have an experience with plywood, I think, or wood in general, and you kind of know it as like a hard thing that's, you can't dig your nails into it or anything. It's like, so to see it in this state, I think you have like a visceral relationship with that kind of action on that material. This, again, is this kind of like crop circle idea where this thing makes an impression in a context that it doesn't belong in. Like this model that I have somehow burns itself into the side of like a construction barrier that's been all postered up with ads and stuff. So it's another way to like contrast the realities, I guess. You know, there's like the combination there is kind of a heightened understanding of what's going on. Again, I'm trying to like invoke something unexplainable but believable. I started using Formica. It worked. It really dovetailed nicely into the sensibility that of 3D modeling, because you have to think of materials as just images mapped onto objects, and I think that's actually like a really useful way of understanding materials moving forward. But we are all nostalgic about things from the past, so we kind of hold on to the value system that we have for them. You know, like we still like marble. It reminds us of certain experiences that might be heightened from the past, but it's actually like not really a good material to use. There's much better things that technology has brought, and so we tend, again, like with the user interface, trying to simulate hand tools and stuff. You know, we're doing that with our materials in construction as well. You know, trying to make phenolic plastic look like marble for some reason, just because we don't want to let go. And yeah, so I guess it's nice how the virtual abstract object burns itself through that faux reality to reveal like the truth of these materials. And I kind of like that relationship where I'm introducing this object that's not real to this material that's not real, and somehow like the truth is exposed. So this was a show in San Francisco at Anthony Meier Fine Arts, which is in a really nice residential building, which seemed like a difficult context to put a show in, because usually you expect like the space to be empty and clear of distractions, but here there were lots of like. There was lots of decorative architecture going on, so it was hard not to deal with that. But it turned out to be like a really good exercise. I kind of was able to imagine objects that should be in that space, but they were applied to that space in a way that was sort of obviously not functional, like sprites, like just little icons or something, like surrogates, and it just became an opportunity to make interesting abstract forms, I think. What was that? Yeah, I mean, not exclusively, but I was definitely thinking of how am I going to address that space and make a successful show, and that influenced the choice of subject matter, basically, and how I would deal with that. So yeah, I mean, that was really an interesting project. So these are, I can't remember if I actually made those. I think these are stock models. Some of the lamps I made, but these ones are stock. And here, the sculpture itself is kind of this thing that, again, isn't there. It's just this thing that's acted on that material and inverted the relationship. The black marble is known to be like a solid, solid, heavy, dense material, impenetrable, but cutting through it exposed the also solid wood, which just has a brighter tone, so it kind of turned the black solid marble into an empty dark space, and the wood becomes just like a glowing light coming from that lamp, and then the physical thing isn't even a part of it anymore. So these I kind of liked because they skirted the necessity to actually like make the thing itself, the subject itself. This was based on I think, Le Corbusier chair. Those toolpaths are like hand scribbled with my mouse on the surface of those panels. And so that project led to this, which was a project that I did in Santa Barbara at the Museum of Contemporary Art there. And so there I inserted architecture that I could actually intervene with. So I built this little lobby, like waiting room area. Sorry, I'm trying to find my mouse. So I inserted this, basically I built that architecture so that I could cut it, because obviously like I couldn't bring the museum to my studio and carve it there. So I designed and built this thing that we shipped there and assembled in place, and also I could just, engrave the surfaces. And it was interesting. Kind of a little all over the place, but it was a really great experiment that has informed a lot of the stuff after. This was another project. This is maybe one of my favorite things, that it definitely came out of this notion, this experiment. I feel like this is more successful. This was a collaboration between David Kennedy Cutler, David Scandavino, and myself. We pitched this project to Locust Projects. And here, what was nice is my work was like the removal of material from their work and the architecture. So we built this whole structure, and basically mapped all the surfaces of the gallery and intervened with them. And so this is that tire object that you see repeating through my subject matter, removed from the corner of the room. And here, that got a little cropped, but here are some new things that I'm working on. Just working on cutting wood incredibly thin. These are tissue boxes, but that doesn't matter. Really just interested in, like, can I carve this object that shouldn't be carved? And what will that look like if I do? Also working with some aluminum, which is a new thing. Yeah, so I don't have a lot to comment on these. They're still pretty fresh. Aluminum version of one of those lamps that I already made in wood. And that's it. Any questions?
I really liked your analogy between like file complexity and a sense of like physicality and weight.
Uh-huh.
Have you had any pieces that have tried to play with either motion or weight as far as like subverting. Like, so when you had that one file that was an example where it was like, oh, this feels like it should be really complicated and it should move slowly, but oh, it's really light and that's kind of an interesting feeling. Have you had any pieces where, like, for example, with the styrofoam, you said it was like sort of mirrored marble, but I guess, yeah, have you had any sculptures that like would seem like weighty, but then like would kind of toy with that idea and then actually be able to be moved like very fluidly or like with seemingly no weight?
You mean like physically,
Yeah,
like physical objects?
Yeah, like physical objects.
I mean, some of those styrofoam pieces I feel like describe something that's massive, but you know, it's styrofoam. You know, it's pretty light. You know, that's like relatively dense styrofoam, but so it's heavier than a coffee cup. But it's I feel like some of those dealt with that in a not so direct way, but in a sense, yeah.
Other questions?
Can you elaborate more on why you choose in some cases to use ready-made models and others to model from scratch?
Usually if I model from scratch, like I need something I can't find. It's all about economy, really, and specificity. And so if I need something that I want and I can't find, like often I'm looking for like the quintessential object. Like recently I downloaded a telephone, and it's an object that I just wouldn't have the time to spend on. And there's a lot of options, and so I could pick the perfect one. Like the perfect one that like sits on Ronald Reagan's desk was the one I was thinking about. That phone was there, you know, like it was red and everything. And I peruse those databases a lot. You know, I just look for weird stuff that I like, but also, you know, like I do enjoy modeling as well. So if there's something that I can't find exactly, or it you know, I don't know, just different scenarios require different models. So like the tissue box, I modeled that myself. That was really fun. It was like a challenge, you know, how am I going to describe that tissue? So I made that. The original one, the one that you saw in the drawing, was one that I made, but the one that was made in wood, these guys were scanned. Yeah. Photogrammetry scanned, but so yeah, I don't know. There's not any like set system really.
So earlier you... Hello, testing. Earlier you touched on the relationship between an artist's work and their studio space. Do you think that in your first smaller space you could have conceived of these like large-scale pieces? Like did you have that vision and you just needed to find the space for it, or do you think it was the other way around?
I was definitely like pushing out the door of that space. So, you know, I was making the most I could manage in that space. And that was kind of exciting, you know, like I enjoyed having all that like chaos. But I don't think I actually like was thinking, oh, I should make like something 8 feet tall, because you know I wouldn't have been able to lay it down on the floor, you know.
Right. And do you feel like your current space is, you know,
That's not true, actually. I did make a couple of things. Like I had to build this big structure to hang it from. Well, I had a really tall ceiling, as you could see. It was like 20 feet tall.
Right.
It was easily 2.5 stories. And so I ended up making like tall things, but no wide things.
And sorry if I'm totally bogarting this microphone, but, you know, clearly a lot of your process and maybe craft is tied up in modeling these really intense 3D things. Would you ever consider working in a virtual space, like where we all put on goggles?
Sure, yeah, definitely. I don't have one, but
or I mean,
yeah, it seems like things are going that way. But it's also like would there be? Well, I'd have to have something to draw me into that medium, I guess. So if there was a reason to go there, I totally would.
But is there? So much of your work is meant to be carved out onto a physical material, right? It's the translation between digital and reality.
I think I'm just trying to get at how to do that thing where you create the impression of an idea.
Okay.
You know, like a believable impression of an idea that like sparks the imagination of the viewer, and however that can happen that's where I'd like to be. I use physical materials because I think I need that physical connection in order to get the most complete experience out of an art object, but that doesn't exclude some kind of totally virtual workspace. You know.
Would it be an incomplete experience then?
Yeah, I mean, I think what would happen is I'd probably make something in there, learn, go through the learning curve, make tons of mistakes, and those mistakes would be weird things that I'd try to understand in other media as well.
I've got kind of a quick question. Just like just looking at these, I think that one of the in the intersection of the sort of virtual and these physical, like I guess I'm wondering about what your feelings are about, say, like tissues here and how there's. I'm not sure if this is working. And so like how these objects and the shapes kind of start to like come up against the reality of the material and fall apart. And it's like the blowouts and the earlier cones. And I'm thinking about that in contrast to some of the earlier prints that were plotted, where you have like a really precise translation of an object onto a flat surface, and it's like really an accurate and true representation, versus this where there's like some interface and static, and it's just like a different, I don't know, maybe you could speak to just how you feel about that, where things sort of collide and sort of just fall apart.
I think that's like what I'm trying to do, like the choices of subject matter. There's usually something weird about it, but also it's what I'm sensitive to is that thing that's hard to describe in one single material. So, the model I made of this object didn't look like this, and so I enjoy the transformation that happens when you do apply an unrelated material to that subject, and there's things about it that just don't compute. It's like that tissue is like, the contrast between this volume, which is something wood is really good at describing, and this like papery, thin, it just evaporates, so. And the drawings, that's another, I don't know what to say. They're harder to control, I guess. It's harder to challenge that system. It's just a drawn line. It helps to see them static sometimes, and in like, paper has a tactile quality too, so I can change the tooth, and maybe I can go back to some of those. But the way the line falls on the paper has a lot to do with how toothy the paper is, how dead the pen is, and those are things. It's kind of like a more of a micro versus macro situation, I guess. It's like really sensitive. Drawing is a more intimate experience. That, you're probably like 12 inches away when you're looking at it, and so they're just different. But I enjoy them as well. Like this is Sharpie on Mylar, so it has a different quality than this ink rapidograph pen on cotton paper. You can't really see it on the screen though. They're hard to photograph because they're very fine lines. Did that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it's just really interesting the way there's like the precision of the modeling and the machinery and the tooling can kind of like yield this sort of unexpected result when the material starts to like become so thin it can't even support itself, and that's like a really fun point.
There's like an element of surprise. I'm trying to set a stage. Like I'm picking an object that I think will interact with this material weirdly. They're unrelated, so let's see what will happen, and then it's kind of latent in that way. It's kind of like I think about developing a photograph a lot.
Yeah.
Because you prepare this situation, you take a photograph, and then you have to develop it. And so I prepare this file, and then I create a milling operation that gets changed to G-code, and then the operation runs, and you see what comes out. And it takes a while, and so you respond by revising the file and doing it again. So it's like kind of it's a little theatrical in that way. You're not like...
It's unpredictable.
Yeah. So I'm definitely trying to coax that out of the relationship between the model and the carving, for sure.
Going back to a lot of the constructions you're doing with these sort of off-the-shelf industrial materials, whether it be the PVC or wheelbarrows or fences, I'm curious if you have a conceptual or symbolic logic for choosing any of these particular objects, or just working with sort of off-the-shelf industrial materials in the first place. Understanding that there's an economy there, of course, because you're like, oh, this is interesting and it's readily available as a material, but there's also symbolic meaning with these sorts of objects that you can't totally excise from the object itself. So you address that, or do you try to incorporate that as a meaning or a subtext of the work, or is it just like...
I think that comes later.
Yeah.
I get, I become sensitive to these qualities, and then I see those things around me, and I just am attracted to it because it's similar. It's like really kind of basic. I'm not conceptualizing it very much. And then you put it together and wait and see if it's good. See if you like it, see if it means anything, and does it create a dialogue when you start showing people. And I think that's like subliminal or something. Like you recognize the value of this comparison for a lot of reasons, but they're not so overt, until they get compiled. It's like you don't really think about that as a surrogate worker. You don't think about politics until after it's done. You're like, oh, this is weird, like a workforce or something. You see, where do you see these construction sites, but also prisons, schools? Everything has baggage, and I think that's what I like. Is you appropriate a material or an object, and it brings its baggage with it, and that's unique to each viewer. So they all have their own specific experiences with that stuff. So it can magnify in that way. It can go like lots of different directions. And I think once you make the thing, you keep it around if it kind of starts that dialogue going. Otherwise, you just edit.
Any other questions? No. I have one question for you. Can you tell us a little more about the techniques that you use, like especially for the white foam 3D models, kind of?
Mm-hmm.
And the last piece with the tissue, like one at the left, I kind of understand, but the on the right, it actually looks like you curved it like in the 3D kind of shape.
I'll tell you about the styrofoam first. Let me see if I have a video, actually. That would be the thing to do. Bear with me. It's sideways. So this is at the Digital Atelier, which is a huge facility in Trent. It's near Trenton, New Jersey. And when they were like a startup, I was able to get in there, and they would do stuff really cheap for me. And then their business, they started to get more business, and like, big artists would show up, and their prices just kept tripling, and so I couldn't keep doing it. But can I open this one? There we go. But basically, it's you input a form and a surface that the tool needs to stay perpendicular to, and then paths that the tool should ride along as it follows that form. And basically that's just, the software does the rest. It like figures out where the tool needs to be in order to reduce that block down to the form that you want to arrive at. This is, here you go. Sorry, these are sideways, guys. I think I shot them with my phone. Yeah, so it's the same idea, just like smaller scale. And we start with a block, and it just cuts down to the surface that I've made in the CAD software. And it just goes line by line, slowly along. That was, sorry, how do I get back to, nope. I totally lost the presentation. Is that it? Here we go. So my machine is only 3-axis, which means you can only cut from, like X, Y, and Z, which is up and down. That big machine with the styrofoam would go around, so you could do undercuts. So this we'd have to cut from one side and then flip it, register it, and cut from the other side. But the wood is flexible, so as you're cutting down on the second side, it would often disintegrate, and so we had to figure out how to support it. So we did that with paraffin wax. We just fill in the void that we created on the first half, and then mill it flush so that the bottom was flat, and then flip it over and then mill it down almost to nothing, and so that's how we got it so thin. Does that make sense?
Just to go back to the studios for a second,
Yeah.
I really liked how you were talking about with Mondrian and the sculptor, how there were elements of their studio that weren't actually their work, but kind of informed the stuff that they were working on. Like, for example, the stovepipe and the big milling bit. Is there any, so like I guess working in a piece of software, there are like you've got the models that you're making, and those end up informing the physical things that you're making. But is there anything kind of personal to your workspace that you'd say that, like, actually just maybe if it's, I'm thinking kind of more personally, but like, even if it's like shortcuts you have or just something about like the way that you actually work on your own computer that you would say like informs what ends up both becoming the model and then also the physical object, like something almost analogous to like the stovepipe or something like that. That's just inherent to the actual system, but isn't necessarily the model that you made.
I don't know about in my own interface, but in my studio, I design and build a lot of the functional aspects of it. Like I made that loft, I made those stairs out of necessity, but also I like making my environment custom. I built the storage, the walls, and I guess it's just sort of like a collection of useful things that I have around that feels custom. Like feels like specific to doing weird stuff that it's not a normal wood shop really. As far as the way my computer's set up, I don't know if it's weird or not. I haven't updated Windows in a while. I like it like it is, I'd have to think about that actually. I'm not really like aware, I don't think. I mean that office is kind of like an amalgam of things on my I'm like working inside of one of the models that I've made. So that's kind of a unique thing to be able to do, and I enjoy living with that thing in a way that it isn't really like it's specific. It's site specific to my own workspace. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.